Good afternoon, and welcome, classmates, to Group 3. Group 3 is going to be talking about the Arab Spring uprisings and Canada's response to the Arab nation. What response, you might say? Exactly our point. Follow along as we take you through the uprisings in 3 major Arab countries and how it's affected its relationship with Canada.
Alright, let's take a few minutes to talk about Syria. Mainly, a man named President Bashar al-Assad, possibly one of the craziest dictators still around today. He's been in power since 2000 after his father died, who was also the previous president. His father has been in power since 1971, which means that his family alone has been ruling Syria for 46 years. At some point, it's good to have a change in power, but the Assad family does not seem to think so. As a result of the Arab Spring protests, a group of schoolboys in the city of Dara was influenced to make anti-government graffiti on a wall near their school. This sparked a lot of outrage. The 15 boys that were involved, they were rounded up, arrested, and tortured. The citizens of Dara, they responded by protesting for the release of the boys. The boys, they were beat up very brutally. One of them was even killed during their torture. And as this protest gained a lot of attention, people were demanding the release of the 15 boys that were originally captured. As a gesture, President Assad released the now 14 boys as one of them was killed. To give you an idea of how brutal President Assad is in dealing with his own citizens, he's used chemical weapons a number of times. There's video evidence that shows many of his own citizens foaming at the mouth, dying from these chemical weapons. A man that is willing to do that to his own citizens, he will stop at no cost to keep his power. How has Canada responded to all of these killings? You might ask, after 400,000 people have died. What Canada has done is they've set up sanctions against Syria, originally close to the time these protests started. These sanctions include no new investments in Syria, so that's going to have a large impact on Syria's economy as Canadians do purchase oil from Syria as well. More of these sanctions include freezing accounts of people that have business in Syria or linked to Assad's regime. Next to the sanctions, what they've done is Canadians have opened up their doors to over 40,000 Syrian refugees. This is small in comparison to the millions of refugees that have left Syria in search of safety, but 40,000 is still a significant number, and Canadians have spent billions of dollars putting this program into place. At one point, Canadian citizens themselves donated $31.8 million for humanitarian aid, which the government also matched, totaling $63.6 million.
The civil war in Yemen has brought many people's lives to an end, as well as cities being destroyed, houses bombed with nothing left but rubble, and our left families starving. The civil war has been going on since 2015 officially, but the conflict in Yemen goes back to 1990, almost 30 years. The conflict in Yemen does not only stem from the conflict in Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also from the history of the country creating a divide. The north and the south sides of Yemen divided in 1990, and later in 1940, 2 rebel sides began a civil war. This was due to the disagreement about who should run the country. In the end, Ali Abdullah Saleh won Yemen's first presidential ballot box, running with 96.3% of the vote. The opposition side had voiced their opinion about there being tampering with the ballot boxes, but nothing was ever confirmed. In 2015, when the Yemeni civil war begun, this outlash was brought on by the changing of presidents, as some did not agree with the new president's way of doing things. There was also heat coming off of the Arab also heat coming off of the Arab Spring uprising that was brought into Yemen, creating more of a divide. This brought on the worst famine in the world in almost 100 years to those living in Yemen, as well as large amounts of the area being bombed and completely flattened to just the rubble of what used to be people's homes. The Canadian response to this is not very clear in how we are going to handle the Civil War and its people. The Canadian government has asked for all of its allies to come together in a peace. Canadian government has asked for all of its allies to come together and unite to end the war peacefully and permanently. One of the issues with this is that the United States has been selling guns and ammunition to the Saudi Arabia people, which in turn are being sent to the Yemeni. Does that sound right? The Canadian response is not very clear in how we are going to handle the Civil War and its people. The Canadian government has asked for all of its allies to come together and unite to end the war peacefully and permanently. One of the issues with this is that the United States has been selling guns and ammunition to the Saudi Arabia people, which in turn is being sent to the Yemen people to be used in their civil war. Since Canada is an ally of the United States, this is hard to come by because Canada is trying to stop the conflict, but since some of our allies are fueling the war, we can't just sit around. Canada has also given $130 million to help with the humanitarian aid to the affected areas that could be reached. The situation in Yemen is pretty much the same, still a lot of fighting, rubble, as well as it's still the worst famine in over 100 years.
So now let's take some time to talk about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the beautiful desert country and the Arab nation, has long-standing roots reaching back to 1744. In 1932, the Al Saud family turned the country of Saudi Arabia into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and has ruled it since. One would say that they've ruled Saudi Arabia with a bit of an iron fist. Now, interestingly, while Saudi Arabia has a very rich, long history of culture and religion, there's also an interesting other part to it that we must consider as well, and that's the economic influence that it has over the rest of the world. 1932 is also the year that Saudi Arabia discovered petroleum. Now, you may ask, why is this such a big deal? Well, the discovery of petroleum and the increase in wealth that it brought to Saudi Arabia really resulted in Saudi Arabia becoming a superpower into its own right. For example, 90% of its current exports are petroleum products, and its four biggest export locations are China, Japan, India, and our friend to the south, the United States. And while this might not seem important to some people, it's really important to understand that from an economic perspective, we don't like to try and piss off our neighbor to the south. They have a lot of influence and a lot of clout. That being said, getting back to Saudi Arabia for a moment, they have not been without their own conflicts internally as well. The Arab Spring riots and revolts reached Saudi Arabia in 2011 and 2012. Now, the people within Saudi Arabia were protesting for some very specific things. They wanted there to be release of the prisoners who were being held without trial. They wanted to stop the discrimination against the minority Shias within the country. They wanted Saudi troop intervention in Iran to end. They wanted equality for women, voting rights, driving rights for women. And of course, there was always what we call the contagion factor, and that's the inspiration from concurrent other regional protests that were going on at the time. So, Canada has had long-standing economic ties with Saudi Arabia, being one of its 17th, ranking 17th in the number of countries that purchase petroleum products from it. Now, when we look at Canadian influence, we also look at the fact that we signed a $15 billion weapons deal with Saudi Arabia in 2014. Now, $15 billion isn't huge in a national working budget, but the loss of $15 billion to said budget can also really have a big influence on a country's economy. This is an arms deal that employs over 3,000 people over 14 years, which is pretty important. Canada's response to all of the Arab Spring uprisings has been tepid at best. Canada tends to take a very passive, very second-guessing approach. We're really nice in Canada. We don't want to piss people off internationally, even in the face of incredible atrocities being committed in the Arab nations. This all changed in 2018 when the Canadian Foreign Minister decided to issue a tweet about Canada's strong feelings about wanting two particular Saudi protesters to be released from jail where they were being held without trial. Well, the response was fast and furious. Saudi Arabia kicked out the Canadian ambassador to Saudi Arabia, pulled back over 500 medical students, and put a cap on any future trade deals with Canada. They also threatened the light armor vehicle weapons deal, that $15 billion deal, which Canada really didn't want to rock the boat about. They went so far as to be showing television shows within their own country that talked about Canada's own pretty horrific record of human rights violations against Indigenous people, and for example, the terrible conditions within our own prison system. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the stance that Saudi Arabia took through all of this was that they thought that countries like Canada should not interfere with other countries' internal matters. Why is this interesting? Because Saudi Arabia is probably one of the countries who has the worst track record of doing just that, interfering with catastrophic results in other countries' internal business.
Thank you for listening to us talk about this